Hello and welcome back to Psychology 301 Learning. This is Dr. Williams and this is the lecture for Unit 3H, Building a Better Critter on Instrumental Conditioning. And in this section, I want to talk about choice behavior. In particular, I want to talk a little bit about Herrnstein's matching law. So this is Richard Herrnstein, professor at Harvard. He was one of B.F. Skinner's prodigies, and he's one of the only individuals that B.F. Skinner ever said. B.F. Skinner told the administration at Harvard that if they didn't give Richard Herrnstein a job, he would quit and leave the university. So they were very good friends initially, but when Herrnstein went off to study choice behavior, remember Skinner liked free operant behavior, and so they had kind of a falling out, but they were both very productive professors at Harvard. And so my academic lineage, if you remember, is I was trained by Edmund Fantino, who studied under Dick Herrnstein, who studied under B.F. Skinner. So that makes B.F. Skinner my academic great-grandfather. That's pretty awesome. Okay, so this is Richard Herrnstein. He studied, and really what he's most famous for in learning is the study of the distribution of responses under a variety of different concurrent schedules. So he would study schedules that were presented in comparison, and he would look to see how organisms responded to them, not only in the absolute rate of responding, but also in what he called the relative rate of responding. So how much they responded on A relative to how they respond on B and C and D. And so he found that in general, the relative rate of responding tends to match the relative rate of reinforcement. So we talked about this last time briefly, and I just want to go into a little bit more detail. All right, so here's the matching law. We talked about it last time. Capital R's are responses, little r's are reinforcers. And he said basically that if you know what the rate of reinforcement is on all alternatives, then you should be able to predict the rate of responding. In other words, the rate of reinforcement, which is abbreviated with little r, so R reinforcers on A divided by, and this would be total reinforcers available in the situation A plus B, will be the same ratio that you would predict for responding. So here's an example. We'll give you an example. So if you're working in the pigeon lab, like I did for 25 years, birds that earn 65% of their grain on the left are going to allocate about 65% of their responses to the left key and only about 35% to the right key. And so that's what you would predict, and it's actually what you find. And the same is generally true for the amount of time they spend responding on one key or another. So, and this is pretty robust. So let me show you a graph. This is the actual matching law. And in this case, what I've done is I've drawn a red line that shows perfect matching. So a perfect ratio between the number of reinforcers on key A and the number of responses on key A. And so the red line is basically what would be perfect matching. And this is from Herrnstein's dissertation. And what you find is that we have 3 pigeons here. And if you look at each animal, their behavior doesn't vary very much from that matching line. And if you so each bird is close, but if you average across birds, you get almost a perfect straight line. That's pretty interesting. Now, sometimes when you look at this, you see a little bit less than perfect matching at an individual. So here they're responding a little bit more than you would expect. Here they're responding a little bit less than you would expect. So let's talk about less than perfect matching. So the first one I want to talk about is overmatching. Overmatching occurs when you draw in your matching line and the critter's relative rate of responding, which is on this axis, is greater than you would predict by looking just at the relative rate of reinforcement. In other words, if they prefer the left key, these are left key responses divided by total responses. So this is a matching part of the matching law. And here's the other half, reinforcers versus all on the left versus all reinforcers. A bird that overmatches is going to show greater preference extremes. They're going to show more preference for the left key when the rates of reinforcement would predict less. So any data that would be an overmatching situation, the data would appear above the matching line. There are some critters, however, that show less than perfect matching. So here we have the same thing, left key preferences and responses, and here we have reinforcers. And now they respond less than would be predicted, so they're undermatching, and that's characterized by greater indifference, so that the preference between the two is less extreme. Now, there is bias associated with direct assessment of choice. When we use just simple concurrent schedules, we run into some problems because you can't really, we've talked about this before, we can't really assess the difference between a fixed ratio and a fixed interval schedule, because the fixed ratio by its very nature is going to encourage a high rate of responding, because that's what ratio schedules do. And the fixed interval actually encourages a low rate of responding until the interval has elapsed. So you get very little, if you were looking at both of these schedules on the, here, I'll draw this here. Okay, so here you would expect a lot of responses, because the faster you respond, the faster you bring reinforcers to yourself. Here, on the other hand, you have an interval that must elapse. Here you're going to have very low rates of responding. They'll wait until the 25 seconds is elapsed, and then they'll go over and respond. So your FR produces a high rate of responding. That's your FR. And your FI is going to produce a very low rate of responding, just due to the unique nature of the schedules. So when you get a relative rate of responding that compares these two alternatives, you'd have lots of responses here, very few responses here. And if you assume that that means that the bird likes this schedule, likes the fixed ratio better than the fixed interval, that may or may not be true. What you're really looking at is just the pattern of behavior that's produced by the schedules themselves. So the solution is to use something called a concurrent chains procedure. Here, there are two phases in assessment of choice. There are two. There's the initial links, which is where you measure choice. Whoops, that's not a good thing. Let me do that again. Here we go. So we have initial links, that is the choice phase, and notice that they are equal. These two choice phases are identical. The VI60 produces the VR150. That's the ratio schedule. The right initial link, instead of producing food, produces the fixed interval schedules. These two schedules produce food. But up here, and this is called the terminal link schedule, or the terminal schedule phase. And so here we have no reason to expect them to behave any more than indifferent between these two schedules, except now they produce different outcomes. So if a pigeon starts to respond more on the VI 60-second schedule, that what they're basically telling you is, I really want to get into this fixed interval schedule because I like it the best. I get to just wait around for 25 seconds and then I get food. Another pigeon could actually respond more on the left alternative, and what he's really doing is saying, I like this alternative because it produces a fixed ratio and I like working on the fixed ratio. But here, the only reason you would predict any preference for one or the other would have to be the schedules that they actually produce, because they are identical. They're even usually presented on equal white key lights. So we measure preference in the initial links based on what each of the initial links produces in the terminal links. Okay, so let's do an example and you can be the bird. So we're going to start with initial links. This is trial 1, initial links. 2 white key lights come on, variable interval 60-second schedules on either key light. At this point, preference should be indifferent. The two schedules don't look any different. They're just white key lights. There's no reason to predict that you would have a preference for one over the other. So you work a little bit on the left, and you work a little bit on the right, you work a little on the left, and you work a little on the right, and suddenly one of the two schedules sets up, the next response produces a change. The right key goes dark, and the left key lights up, and you now have to complete a fixed ratio 150-second schedule, and when you do, you get 5 seconds of food. When the food is over, trial 2 begins. trial 2 begins by getting a new VI value. So it might be a VI 60, or it might be a VI 40, or it might be a VI 75. And here, whatever this one was, it just picks up where it left off. So it's well into its working toward its alternative. So now you go back and forth and back and forth. And one of the two sets up, say the right key sets up, and the next key peck produces a change. The left key goes dark. That variable interval freezes, and you now have to complete a fixed interval 25-second schedule. You get 5 seconds of food, and then you go back to your initial links. And this goes on day after day, maybe 60 trials a day, and the animals slowly begin to make contact with the idea that the left key produces the fixed ratios and the right key produces the fixed intervals. And so alone, you would expect preference here to be 50-50. But based on the outcomes, they begin to shift their preference toward the left or the right key, depending on what their preference really is. So over time, preference shifts in favor of the preferred terminal link schedule. And so bias is eliminated as long as you measure choice in these equal initial links. And so it's a really superior method for assessing choice because you don't introduce the bias associated with the nature of the schedules themselves. So it's really good for assessing preference for things that are really, really different. And you can use the concurrent change method to study things like conditioned reinforcement. Those when the key lights change from white to a color, that red or that green is kind of a conditioned reinforcer associated with food. And it also is associated with the delay to food. How long does it take, or how much work is involved in getting to food? So it serves kind of like a conditioned reinforcer. So we've been able to study conditioned reinforcement for 50 years using this procedure, 40 years using this procedure. I use this procedure to study foraging-related choice behavior, so that the initial links represent the general search phase, and the terminal links represent the actual handling and consumption phases of a foraging simulation. And it's been used to study self-control. So the kinds of choices that can be assessed, self-control is the one that your book spends a lot of time on. And so I want to talk just a little bit about impulsivity and self-control. And then in the last lecture for this unit, we'll go into self-control in a lot more detail. So first of all, when we talk about self-control, what do we do when we're faced with the following choice? You only have two options. You can either choose a smaller, more immediate reward, or you can choose a larger reward, but it's more delayed. The first is, we call it impulsivity, when you choose the smaller, more immediate reward, and self-control is defined as choosing the larger, more delayed reward. And so that's really the situation that we try to create. We create self-control questions by pitting small immediate rewards against larger, more delayed rewards to see what factors will influence behavior. And there's actually two major factors. One of them is reinforcer size, and the other one is the length of the delay to food. So in the next unit, we're going to talk a lot about the effect of the size of the reinforcer and the effect of delays when added or subtracted from a self-control paradigm. So knowing about the concurrent change procedure and concurrent choice is a really good way to understand the self-control literature better. So I'm going to stop here, and then you can go on to the next lecture with this little bit of background. Go on to the next lecture so that it'll make a little bit more sense. Okay, so have a good evening, and we'll see you back in Unit 3I.